we human beings, we strange beings, we will do many things unthinkingly in our lives. And someone is likely to describe some of those things as freedom. But if they do so, they'll be making a mistake. The things that we do unthinkingly, we do not do freely, even if there's no impediment to our doing them. When we say that we have no impediments to doing what we do, and we describe that as freedom, we're actually describing nothing very different from the ball that rolls down a hill without a stone being in its path. There's no glory in that, no credit for it. It's just something that happens to it. We aren't concerned with whether there are impediments to our action. We're concerned whether we can choose our action. So when I spoke of Frederick Douglass going towards something when he escaped slavery, I meant he was trying to place himself in the situation where the fullest possible effect of his own choices could be realized, where he could choose the purposes and move toward them deliberately. Now that's what freedom is about. But it means not choosing just any purpose, because human beings are certain kinds of beings. Therefore, they have appropriate purposes. Let me put it this way. Why would anyone consider it freedom for a human being to choose to do an inhuman thing? That's not a freedom. That is irresponsibility. You can call it any number of things, but it's not freedom.
I can be free in the sense that I play a musical instrument without any training, without any instruction, without any learning, but essentially that amounts to me just banging away on the piano or rubbing away on the violin without making any beautiful music. Instead, all I get is noise and static. On the other hand, however, if I train myself, if I discipline myself, if I am humble enough to submit myself to the guidance of those who are wiser than me, then I can learn to begin to play the piano. I can learn to begin to play music that others have written. I can even learn to begin to compose my own music. In other words, I can create something beautiful with this freedom. But that's freedom for excellence. It's not freedom in the sense that I can just choose whatever I want arbitrarily and willy-nilly. What it's about is choosing what makes us better as human beings, which means having an appreciation of the truth about ourselves and the truth about the way that the world has been made. Of course, it's possible for societies that value liberty to basically reduce freedom to what we call freedom of indifference, in the sense that none of my choices matter. One choice is just as good as another choice. Drug use is just as good as viewing beautiful art in a Parisian museum. There's a decisive difference between the two. But if we view these things as being essentially the same, that there is no difference in the way that we make our choices, that there is no difference in the essential ends that we choose with our freedom, then not only do I think do we start to become slaves of our own passions and slaves of popular opinion and slaves of whatever a particular arbitrary majority happen to want at a particular point in time, but perhaps more worryingly and more fundamentally, we start to erode slowly but surely the foundations of the civilization that makes our freedom possible. When we think about the history of Christianity, we of course see some very bad things. We see Christians not living up to what the Christian gospel demands of its adherents. So, we see people who engage in Machiavellian behaviour, we see treachery, we see betrayal, we see people stealing, killing, etc., etc., etc. But what's interesting is the very fact that Christians can write this own history about themselves. Because if we compare that to the types of histories that were often written in the ancient world and in the pre-Christian world, such as the histories and the biographies of someone like Alexander the Great, we see these great eulogies, these great stories of how these people had done all these wonderful things, and yes, one might be critical here and there, but basically there is this very self-affirming understanding of the lives of the great peoples of these times. But when we compare that, for example, to the Hebrew scriptures, what we see is this deeply self-critical history. Even the greatest kings of Israel, such as David, for example, and his son Solomon, what we find there is that despite these wonderful stories that are present about them in the Hebrew Scriptures, we also find this deeply critical analysis of their behavior, their actions, their choices. We see them being rebuked by prophets of the Old Testament. So this is very important because we have to remember that this type of historical self-awareness is really not very well known outside the Jewish context and outside the wider Christian context, when this tradition of understanding history and the way of writing history begins to transcend the Jewish world and permeate the rest of what we call today Western civilization. It's very common for us to talk about radical documents in Western history, but I think one of the most radical documents was a letter written in the 1st century AD from an obscure Jewish rabbi to a Roman slave owner. And the gist of the letter was this: I have your escaped slave. I'm sending him back to you. Really, he's the same as you. He's another human being. Maybe you'd like to think about freeing him.
There's a very interesting and short epistle in the New Testament, the letter to Philemon, who was a Christian man and a slave owner. His slave, Onesimus, had escaped and run away, and he finds the Apostle Paul and, interestingly, repents of his fleeing and asks the apostle, or the apostle volunteers, I'm not sure, to write a letter to his owner and to receive him back. And that's what the letter to Philemon is. What's, I guess, most interesting is that Paul commends Onesimus to his owner Philemon as an equal, as a Christian brother, even though there's this accepted economic relationship. And Paul does not really address the economic relationship directly. He addresses the human relationship.
That didn't mean they had to have the same occupation, it didn't mean that they had to have the same wealth, or even occupy the same status within the social order that had existed at the time. What is the same is their equality and dignity.
And it's this sort of Christian view of humanity, right? That there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, but we're all one, we're all brothers, we're all equal before God. That is an idea that transformed Europe and transformed the world. It still does.